Did the 34th President of the United States have meetings with aliens? What were those meetings all about? Today to discuss this topic, we have with us today a researcher and also a writer on the subject, and also the great-granddaughter of the president who have had meetings with aliens. But before we get to our interview, I'd like to ask all our viewers to subscribe to our channel down below for various interviews on different topics. Because this is Zain Khan, and we're live. Welcome to Zain Khan Live, where everything is discussed and nothing is censored. Today, the guest of our show is the great-granddaughter of the 34th U.S. President, Dwight Eisenhower. Today, our guest is Laura Eisenhower. Welcome to our show, Laura. This is Zain Khan. It is a pleasure having you on Zain Khan Live.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Laura, today we're going to be discussing a lot about your great-grandfather. Let's get to our first question. As the great-granddaughter of the 34th U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, it has been said that he has had interactions with aliens. According to your research, is that true?
At this point, I would say yes. I mean, there's a lot of whistleblowers. There's a lot of information that's out there that's made it very clear, and it makes sense as far as what we're seeing in the world today that something like that may have been going on. I do know that the origins of it did not start with Eisenhower, and it's been going on for a while. Phil Schneider even says since 1926, ETs have been associating with our governments.
Laura, were those interactions like official meetings or just interactions?
I'm not sure about since 1926. I do know that during Roosevelt's administration, they attempted to make contact, but the actual gray alien treaty began with Aleister Crowley, Winston Churchill, and Hitler, from what I've researched. And anybody can find out more about that on energeticsynthesis.com or in the Ascension Glossary that really lays out the hidden history connected with ET government treaties. And that was when the abduction started to take place. And so the Greada Treaty in 1954, at that stage they considered it a surrender. They didn't consider it so much a treaty. And there were two different levels to it. One that was related to the NSA and a part of the NSA that's called the Blue Unit, that's a government unto itself. And then there was like these agreements made that sounded very different than what actually happened because the treaties were broken. So you've got sort of the shadow government side of it, and then you have the president's side of it, but they're not fully in the know. They don't have the full picture. And so there was a lot of manipulation when it came to that. Supposedly he had about 3 different meetings, one at a California base, Air Force base, and 2 in New Mexico.
Laura, let's get to a very important question. Which race of aliens did Dwight Eisenhower actually meet in his meetings? Because some say that it was the Greys, some say it was some other race. Which race did he actually meet?
Well, if there's more than one meeting, there's different races. The first one supposedly was with the Nordics, and they were not able to reach an agreement. There is suspicions of their intentions, and not everybody was able to agree because the war just ended and we were still dealing with the Cold War, and the Nordics supposedly wanted them to give up the nuclear weapons. And at the same time, there's been an association between the Nordics and some of these darker agendas, and as they were trying to figure it out, then another meeting ended up happening, and that's the Greada Treaty in 1954 with the Greys, and that was after an agreement couldn't be reached with the Nordics. And what has been said is that Colonel Philip Corso, who was a former advisor to President Eisenhower's National Security Council, said that these creatures weren't benevolent, They didn't come to enlighten human beings. They were genetically altered. And we had to negotiate a kind of surrender with them as long as we couldn't fight them. And so MJ-12 ended up getting their hands on the alien technology because they were already created in Truman's administration. There was already Roswell happening, and there was already a lot going on connected to extraterrestrials and UFOs. None of that was new. But their whole deal was that they were trying to ask us to assist them in saving their dying race in exchange for certain technologies. And those technologies, have to do with, on some level, you would hear about like free energy and metals and alloys and even things that could help the medical world. But then I think between the NSA, it was more about mind control and abductions, because we're dealing with sort of two different scenarios going on in one meeting. And again, we see this in our governments where there's like a facade to make something happen so that it's tracked and it's visible to a certain degree, or eventually it was going to come out. But this hidden thing with the NSA, nobody had known about that. And through a lot of my research, I discovered this. And Alex Collier, a contactee of the Andromeda Council, has been talking about this and sharing this unit of the NSA was the one behind the treaties. And so the way it was presented to the president was very different, and the people that he was with was very different than I think what the real deal was that he wasn't in the know about. And that's where the treaties got broken and there was deception. Because whatever they agreed to as far as the surface government is not what ended up happening. And that's where I think this other factor came in with the NSA. And what that whole shadow government's all about. I mean, there's compartmentalism, there's things that we don't see. There's associations and alliances that were already established before Eisenhower came along. And they try and put the pieces where they want to put them in order to achieve a certain agenda.
Laura, you've just discussed some purpose, but tell us, what was the real purpose behind Eisenhower's meeting with the aliens?
Well, I mean, it's to create some sort of treaty so that, kind of like creating a win-win situation. The extraterrestrials, or the technology was something that we couldn't fight. And that's why it was a surrender. But as far as the ETs were concerned, we could have some of those technologies as long as they could experiment on us. So when we look at it from the viewpoint of the extraterrestrials, they want access to the human genome, the DNA. They want to be able to experiment and gain genetic information because they're a dying race. They want to create hybrid programs. They want to take things from our bodies. They want to implant with alien implants so that we can be easily mind controlled. So, and some are in desperation because they've been controlled by like the reptilian agenda and they're somewhat enslaved by it. Some are staying in sort of a service to self mentality and still aligned with that agenda, and some really want to break out and want our help. So I think there's two sides to it, and I think there's many different types of grays, but it's everything from wanting our genetic information in order to create a mind control society even more so than it's been, or the other one would be to help them get what they lost when they digressed as a race. And so we're dealing also with like time travel and other kinds of things. As far as we were concerned, if we had these more advanced technologies that would give us maybe a better position in the world, especially with the Nazis and what happened with World War II and how they had their hands on some of these kind of technologies. So it's just kind of the reason they didn't side with the Nordics is they were afraid they'd be too vulnerable, and it wasn't worth it, as we see, because the treaty was broken, and whatever deal that they made was not an honest deal, because the abductions have gotten out of control, and it seems that the darker side of that agenda or those treaties has been to really, really compromise the human population, particularly through things like mind control. Then we see the chemtrails, and then there's like alternatives 1, 2, and 3, which are different scenarios in the event of a catastrophe. But that's all very engineered because most catastrophes are due to this weather manipulation and geoengineering that can create superstorms. So it's to create these kind of scenarios by working with the dark part of the shadow government while it relates to more surface government officials like Eisenhower in a way that seemed a lot more harmless than it really was. So he got deceived because that's not what he wanted for the human race or for us.
Laura, you just said that it didn't all start with Eisenhower. Were there other U.S. presidents that have had meetings with aliens?
During the time that Franklin Roosevelt was president, supposedly several species of gray aliens contacted all the major world governments and made secret treaties with many of them. But Roosevelt was not one of the ones that made the deals. From what I heard, it was Churchill who made the deals. And the intention was to create continual world wars, which is the whole strategy of divide and conquer, drain them from all their resources and life force, that kind of thing. So Truman, I mean, he was in the Roswell era. I mean, he was setting up these three-letter organizations, including, MJ-12. I don't know how much Truman knew or what kind of contact he had, but it was basically the Crowley-Churchill-Hitler connection is what established the gray alien agreements with the government. And 5,000 or so children got abducted from poor areas, and it gave the Greys the rights to genetic testing of the population. And it took something like 10 times. They took something like 10 times the amount that they were told, and then they realized that they had led the world population into what we're dealing with now. And we had Project Paperclip, and the Nazi scientists moving into the U.S. And so they were easily able to kind of keep this alliance going from behind the scenes somehow. And so this final treaty was very different than the original ones that were behind a lot of the things, all the experimentations that happened during the Second World War ended up moving over to America. And I think these ET government treaties with the American government is that kind of infiltration because it involves, that mentality. Of that mindset. I mean, we're talking the Zionists and Nazi thing, that's the Illuminati. It's not, their whole deal is to create wars, though, so that we think it's all about, they're on different sides. But they're a part of just like one shadow government that's trying to pull the strings that seem to be working with these Dracos, and the Greys are connected to it. And again, not all Greys are because a lot of them have been compromised. So it's very, complex. And not every being is the same or what they'd like to see happen. Not all of it's the same, but then there's ones that are just in a hive mind and they just function off of signals like radio waves, and they all think the same. But then there's others that are really trying to rescue their race. So it's very mysterious in as far as which he had the most direct contact with or how many different types he had contact with. But I know there was definitely the Nordics and the Greys and supposedly a reptilian representative. I'm not too sure, though. I've heard that in a few places. And, after the Second World War, we still tried to negotiate with the Nazis because the war wasn't over. And they had UFOs. The Nazis flew UFOs over Washington, D.C., July 29th, 1952. And it was clear that the MJ-12 had more power than the president, and they're the ones that already had alien technology. So when they flew those UFOs over over Washington D.C., that's the beginning of when the Nazis were very successful in taking over the military-industrial complex. Because it created that intimidation, there was really nothing they could do. We didn't have those kind of technologies. And so we just kind of got dragged into it.
Okay, so were their reason behind meeting the aliens similar to as of your great-grandfather?
Well, I think it's the same agenda, but, there's some that are willing to work with them. And they're, and then for Eisenhower, I mean, he immediately recognized that the situation was out of control, and he demanded that Area 51 get invaded so that they could figure out what exactly was going on. And it infuriated, Eisenhower to not have the briefing that he expected from MJ-12. He thought more people were on his side. And then he realized that this was branching off into something that he really had no control over. The secret space program, he wasn't able to, properly tend to or monitor. He didn't have the leadership position there. And it needed that kind of leader. So it got out of control, this infiltration. So as infiltration grows like a virus, I think the beings had the same intention. As far as what Crowley, Hitler, and Churchill, they didn't seem to fight against it. They didn't give us a warning like Eisenhower did. He gave us a warning about the military-industrial complex. So I think they were more mind-controlled and easily in agreement to it. It was said that Churchill didn't have any racial sympathies, and he didn't really have an issue with this abduction scenario. And again, by the time Eisenhower stepped into office, it was considered a surrender. I don't think he would have been in agreement if they presented it that there was going to be a mass amount of abductions. And even what they presented to Churchill was more, they abducted more than they originally said. So it's still some level of deception. I don't know Churchill well enough as far as what kind of character he had, but I haven't heard very many good things, but that's okay. There's negative stuff written about everybody, but when it comes down to these agendas, I think there's deception. I think there is the promise of, some sort of reward for being in agreement. Mostly people are manipulated by power and money. Eisenhower wasn't. Even the law of one states that he wasn't bent on power at all, but his hands were kind of tied by that point. And I'm not trying to stand up for him here. It's, I've done enough research to see this kind of evidence. When I first started talking about all of this, I really didn't know what his full intentions were or how he was really thinking. But I felt deep down that there was a lot to research on it, and I kept following my heart and my intuition. But, the whole thing is, to infiltrate humanity, to enslave us because we're their food source. So we're dealing with a lot of different levels of this extraterrestrial thing, and how it's not just, off planet. We're talking, underground, and things that they're breeding, cloning and, and Hollywood and, our shadow governments and even, certain religions are involved in all this. So it's one thing to present a treaty to somebody that's not interested in world domination and new world order compared to ones that are either mind controlled by it or in agreement to it because they want whatever's been offered to them, whatever rewards might come with it.
Laura, let's get to the last question. Why do governments keep these meetings a secret, and why are aliens so interested in meeting presidents?
Because if they are working with the governmental structures, then they have their hooks in the rest of us, because, it's almost like our government's alien already. Now a lot is changing, a lot is getting exposed. But if there's an agenda, they don't want humanity to know. They don't want us to know that our tax dollars go into these black ops projects or these off-planet operations, and or else there would be a major revolt. The ones that were more well-intentioned thought that we weren't ready for this kind of information, even if we were talking about the benevolent ones. And some researchers, even thought that there was a time where maybe it wasn't appropriate for us to know certain things, but that's not the case anymore. So there's two types of secrecy. One is part of the agreement, and part of the treaties of the Greada Treaty is that we keep it secret. They created laws, the NSA created laws too, that you'll be heavily fined or imprisoned, and people get murdered for disclosing this kind of stuff. So that was more the NSA that, for national security reasons, made sure that none of this would be spoken about. So even if Eisenhower or others wanted to, and we see that those like Phil Schneider and William Cooper who did, lost their lives. So even if they wanted to, there was that. But there's also that notion that they wanted to wait till they got a grip on the situation before they were going to bring us into it, because that would be chaotic. We're dealing with a galactic war here still, so and they're trying to sort it out and figure it out, and what our part is. But as long as they can relate to our governments and maybe create through a compartmentalized strategy, work dealings even on levels and in places that the president can't even see, and then still create some sort of deal with the president himself or his advisors, then we're only processing the thing that maybe somebody will blow the whistle on and we won't notice the deeper and deeper layers that relate to things that have been an issue in our history for thousands and thousands of years. When it comes to Anunnaki, when it comes to our DNA being messed with, when it comes to AI and artificial intelligence and the formation of these sort of timelines, we realize it's not just some aliens coming in and landing and just saying, hey, who are you? Let's do some trade. I mean, we're talking a lot of facades being created in order for this to be able to operate from behind the scenes on a much larger scale than I think we can wrap our heads around. I mean, this is old stuff, but yeah. And so the covertness of it all is because the secrecy is what allows them to do what they do, because we're talking like vampiric dark technologies that siphon our energy. We're talking abduction, where it's taking stuff from us. If we were to know about all of that, then their agenda wouldn't succeed. So being a whistleblower means that we have to know, and some of us are willing to talk because too much is at stake, of course. So it takes a whistleblower to want to disclose all this stuff. Everybody else is either afraid because they've been blackmailed, or they're waiting for whatever reward and what they can get out of it, or they're being duped and they don't really know what's really going on. So, I mean, there's just a lot to the picture.
Thank you so much, Laura Eisenhower, for being on Zain Live. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was Laura Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of the 34th President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. We were discussing aliens and also her great-grandfather's meetings with aliens. We discussed so much more and also discussed on topics like mind control. But before we get to the end of our show, I'd like to ask all our viewers to subscribe to our channel down below for different interviews on various topics. Because this is Zain Khan, and we're live.